Welcome to the channel. I know many of you listen to these videos to relax or fall asleep, and I'm really glad you're here. Before we start today's crime stories, please take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already. And if there's any crime story you'd like me to narrate for you, feel free to request it in the comment section. Now let's begin. Story 1. Charles Raymond Starkweather was born on November 24, 1938, in Lincoln, Nebraska. He was the third of 7 children born to Guy and Helen Starkweather. The Starkweather family was poor and lived in a small, run-down house on the south side of the city. Guy Starkweather worked as a carpenter, but he suffered from rheumatoid arthritis in his hands. This condition made it very difficult for him to work, and he was often unemployed. To keep the family fed and clothed, Charles's mother, Helen, worked long hours as a waitress. Money was always tight, and the family lived a simple, working-class life. From a very young age, Charles had physical problems. He was born with a condition called genu varum, which made his legs bow outward. Because of this, his walk looked different from other children's. He also had a speech impediment, which made it hard for him to say certain words clearly. These physical differences made him a target for other kids. When he started attending Saratoga Elementary School, other children teased him and called him names. Charles later said that he was picked on constantly and that he had no happy memories of his time in school. However, one of his elementary school teachers later said she did not remember him being teased, showing that Charles may have felt the pain of being different more deeply than others saw. As Charles grew older and entered Irving Junior High School, his body changed. He became physically stronger. Instead of continuing to be a victim, he decided to fight back. He used his new strength to bully the same kids who had once picked on him. Fighting and being physically aggressive became a way for him to gain power and respect. He discovered that he was good at physical education, and it was the only subject in school that he enjoyed. Sports gave him an outlet for his anger and a place where he felt superior to others. By the time he reached Lincoln High School, Charles's behavior had become a serious problem. He had a temper that could explode without warning. A friend from high school, Bob Von Bush, later described 2 very different sides to Charles. One side was fun and kind. He could be a loyal friend who liked to joke around. But the other side was mean and cruel. If Charles saw a man on the street who was bigger, better looking, or dressed in nicer clothes, he would feel a deep rage and try to bring that person down. He was filled with a bitter envy of anyone who had more than he did. Charles's home life was also unstable and violent. His father, Guy, later admitted in court that he had once pushed Charles so hard that the boy crashed through a window. The marriage between Guy and Helen was filled with conflict. Helen eventually divorced Guy, citing his extreme cruelty as the reason. The violence Charles saw at home and the rage he felt inside began to make him even more unpredictable. His family, including his parents and siblings, became afraid of him. They never knew when his violent outbursts would happen. Academically, Charles had no interest in school. He felt that it had nothing to offer him. In his senior year, just months before he would have graduated, he decided to drop out. Leaving school meant leaving any chance for a different future behind. After dropping out, he took a low-paying job at a newspaper warehouse. It was a job that required little skill and offered little money. In 1956, when Charles was 18 years old, his life changed when he met a girl named Carol and Fugate. Carol was only 13 at the time. She lived in a poor neighborhood similar to his own. Charles became immediately infatuated with her. He saw her as his girlfriend and wanted to spend all his time with her. He quit his job at the newspaper warehouse because it was too far from her school. He found a new job as a garbage collector, which allowed him to be near her neighborhood and see her more often. Charles tried to act like a normal boyfriend. He taught Carol how to drive a car. One day, while she was driving, She crashed the car that belonged to Charles's father. This made Guy Starkweather furious. As punishment, he kicked Charles out of the family home. With no money and no place to live, Charles had to find a place to stay. Sometimes he slept in his car. Other times, he stayed with friends or with Carol's family. He felt that the world was against him and that he had nothing to lose. He began to develop a dark and simple belief. Because his present life was so bad, he could do whatever he wanted in the future, no matter how wrong it was. He talked about robbing banks and decided that in the end, all people are the same because they all die. In late November 1957, Charles was driving around Lincoln. He stopped at a gas station to buy a stuffed animal for Carol. He did not have enough money to pay for it, and the young attendant, a 21-year-old man named Robert Calvert, refused to let him have it on credit. This small rejection made Charles deeply angry. He drove away, but the anger did not leave him. He thought about the gas station and the attendant all night. The rejection, his poverty, and his rage all mixed together in his mind. He decided to go back. Late on the night of November 30th, 1957, Charles Starkweather drove back to the gas station where Robert Calvert worked. He was still thinking about how the young attendant had refused to sell him the stuffed animal. This time, Charles was prepared. He brought a shotgun with him. He parked his car near the station, but did not go in right away. He waited and watched. Several times during the night, he went into the station to buy small things like cigarettes or gum. Each time, he looked at Robert Calvert and felt the anger grow inside him. He was waiting for the right moment when no other customers were around. Finally, very late, the station was empty. Charles walked in and pointed the shotgun at Robert Calvert. He demanded money from the cash register. Robert was frightened and did as he was told. He opened the register and gave Charles about $100. Charles took the money, but he did not leave. He decided that he could not let Robert go because Robert had seen his face and could identify him to the police. He ordered Robert to get into his own car and drive out of town. Robert drove, with Charles sitting next to him, holding the shotgun. They drove to a remote, empty area outside the city. No one else was around. Charles ordered Robert to stop the car. They both got out. Then something went wrong. Robert suddenly grabbed for the shotgun. The two men struggled over the weapon. During the fight, the gun went off and Robert was hit in the head. He fell to the ground, wounded but still alive. Charles stood over him. He later said he felt no emotion, no fear, and no regret. He fired the shotgun several more times into Robert's head, killing him. He left the body there in the dark, got back into his own car, and drove away. For weeks after this murder, Charles continued his normal life. He went to work. He visited Carol. No one suspected him. He felt powerful because he had gotten away with it. This feeling would lead directly to what he did next. On the morning of January 21st, 1958, Charles walked to the small house where Carol lived with her mother, stepfather, and baby half-sister. Carol was not home at the time. Her mother, Velda Bartlett, and her stepfather, Marion Bartlett, were there. They did not like Charles. They thought he was a bad influence on Carol. When Charles knocked on the door, they told him to go away and to stop seeing Carol. This rejection made Charles furious. It reminded him of the rejection he felt from his own family and from the world. He did not leave. Instead, he pushed his way inside the house. Once inside, the argument became violent. Charles was carrying a rifle. He raised it and shot Marion Bartlett in the head, killing him instantly. Velda Bartlett heard the shot and ran toward the sound. Charles shot her as well, killing her. Now there was a problem. 2-year-old Betty Jean Bartlett, Carol's little sister, was in the house. She had seen what happened, and she was crying. Charles later claimed that he did not want to hurt the baby, but he believed she would tell someone what she had seen. He took the baby into another room and killed her by striking her in the head. He then hid the 3 bodies. He put Marion and Velda in an old outhouse behind the house. He hid the baby's body in a chicken coop. He covered them with old newspapers and other trash. A short time later, Carol and Fugate arrived home from school. What happened next is something she and Charles always told different stories about. Charles later said that Carol was there the whole time and helped him. Carol always said that she came home to find Charles waiting for her with a gun. She said he told her that her family was being held hostage and that if she cooperated with him, they would be let go. She said he threatened to kill them if she did not do what he said. She also said he told her that if she tried to run or call the police, he would kill her family first. Whatever the truth, Carol stayed with Charles in the house for the next 6 days. During those 6 days, they lived a strange and quiet life in the small house. To keep people from getting suspicious, Charles wrote a note and put it on the front door. The note said, "Everybody's sick with the flu, sick." People who came to the house, including Carol's grandmother and a friend, saw the note. They knocked, but no one answered. Sometimes they heard movement inside, but the door stayed locked. This made Carol's grandmother worried. She went to the police and told them something was wrong. The police came to the house on January 27th. They looked in the windows and saw that the house seemed normal. Nothing appeared to be disturbed. They did not have a search warrant, so they did not break the door down. They left, thinking the grandmother was worried for no reason. That same day, January 27th, Charles and Carol knew they could not stay in the house any longer. They had used up all the food. The police had come, and it was only a matter of time before they came back. They packed some things and left. They walked to the home of a man named August Meyer. August was a 70-year-old family friend who lived alone on a farm near the small town of Bennett, Nebraska. Charles thought August would give them a place to stay or help them get a car. But when they arrived, something went wrong. Perhaps August refused to help. Perhaps he threatened to call the police. Charles raised his shotgun and fired, killing August Meyer with a single blast to the head. He also shot and killed August's dog so it would stop barking. After leaving the farm, Charles tried to drive away in his own car, but the roads were muddy from recent snow. The car got stuck, and they could not get it out. They were now on foot in the middle of the countryside. While they were trying to figure out what to do, another car came down the road. It was driven by a 17-year-old boy named Robert Jensen. With him was his girlfriend, 16-year-old Carol King. They were teenagers out for a drive. They saw Charles and Carol standing by the stuck car and stopped to see if they needed help. This was a dangerous moment for Charles. He needed a new car, and he could not let these two teenagers drive away and tell the police they had seen him. He pulled out his gun and forced Robert and Carol to drive to a remote spot near an old abandoned storm cellar. He ordered everyone out of the car. He then shot Robert Jensen in the back of the head, killing him. He turned to Carol King. He tried to assault her sexually, but she fought back hard. She screamed and scratched and would not stop resisting. Charles became angry. He shot her as well, killing her. He left both bodies near the storm cellar. Charles later said that Carol shot Carol King, but Carol always said she stayed in the car and never touched a gun. They then drove away in Robert Jensen's car. Now they had a new car, but they needed money and supplies. Charles had a new plan. He drove to a wealthy neighborhood in Lincoln. He chose a large, expensive house that belonged to a rich man named Chester Lauer Ward, his wife Clara, and their maid Lillian Fenkel. Charles broke into the house while no one was home. Lillian Fenkel, the maid, arrived first. Charles grabbed her and stabbed her to death. Then he waited. The family had a small dog that would not stop barking. Charles worried the barking would alert someone, so he broke the dog's neck and killed it. He then hid and waited for the Wards to come home. Clara Ward arrived first, alone. Charles attacked her with a knife, stabbing her to death. He later admitted to throwing a knife at her, but he also claimed that Carol did most of the stabbing. When Chester Lauer Ward came home from work that evening, Charles shot him with a shotgun. Now there were 3 more dead bodies in the house. Charles and Carol took money, jewelry, and other valuables from the house. They also did something strange. They found the morning newspaper, which had pictures of them on the front page. The news of the murders at Carol's house was out, and their faces were all over the news. They cut out these pictures and kept them. They also found food in the kitchen and ate a meal while sitting in the dead family's dining room. Then they took the Ward's expensive black Packard car and drove away from Nebraska, heading west. The murders of the Ward family and their maid caused panic across the state. Police were searching everywhere. The governor called in the National Guard. People were scared and angry. They formed groups of vigilantes, ordinary citizens who wanted to catch the killers themselves. The police were under enormous pressure. Meanwhile, Charles and Carol were driving through Nebraska and into Wyoming. But the Packard was now a famous car. Its picture was in every newspaper. Anyone who saw it would recognize it immediately. Charles knew he needed another car. On January 29, 1958, they were driving along a highway outside Douglas, Wyoming. They saw a parked car. It was a Buick, and a man was sleeping inside it. The man was Merle Collison, a traveling salesman. Charles woke him up. What happened next is not completely clear. Charles claimed he only wanted to steal the car, but Merle fought back. During the struggle, Charles's shotgun jammed and would not fire. He later claimed that Carol picked up a rifle and shot Merle Collison, killing him. Carol always denied this, saying she was never involved in any shooting. But Merle Collison was dead, shot in the car. Charles now had a new problem. Merle Collison's car had a special parking brake that Charles had never seen before. He did not know how to release it. He got in the driver's seat, but the car would not move. He tried to start it and drive away, but the brake was still on. While he was struggling with the car, another vehicle pulled up behind him. A man named Joe Sprinkle, a geologist, had seen the 2 cars parked on the side of the road and stopped to see if he could help. He thought Charles was a motorist in trouble. Joe Sprinkle walked up to the driver's side window. Charles rolled the window down, and Joe saw the dead body of Merle Collison lying across the front seat. He realized something was terribly wrong. At that same moment, Charles pointed a rifle at Joe. The 2 men started to struggle over the gun. While they were fighting, a police car arrived. It was Deputy Sheriff William Romer, who was driving by and saw the commotion. As the deputy got out of his car, Carol Fugate ran toward him. She was screaming. Different witnesses heard different things. Some heard her say, "It's Starkweather. He's going to kill me." Others heard her say, "Please help me, he's crazy." What is known for certain is that she ran away from Charles and toward the police officer. In that moment, their time together was over. Charles let go of Joe Sprinkle, got back in the Packard, and sped away. A high-speed chase began, with police cars chasing him at speeds over 100 miles per hour. A police officer fired a shot that broke the windshield. Glass cut Charles's face, and he began to bleed heavily. He thought he was dying. Afraid that he would bleed to death, he pulled over and surrendered. He was arrested on the highway near Douglas, Wyoming, on January 29, 1958. When Charles Starkweather surrendered on the highway near Douglas, Wyoming, on January 29, 1958, he was bleeding heavily from cuts on his face caused by the broken windshield. The police officers approached him carefully, not knowing if he would try to fight again. But Charles was frightened by the blood. He thought he was dying. He did not resist. The officers handcuffed him and took him to the jail in Douglas. At first, Charles would not stop talking. He told the officers that he had acted alone and that Carol and Fugate was an innocent victim whom he had taken against her will. He said she had nothing to do with any of the killings. Carol was also taken into custody. She was brought to the same jail, but she was held in a separate room. She told the police a very different story. She said that Charles had killed her family and then held her as a prisoner. She said she was afraid for her life and that was why she stayed with him. She claimed she never took part in any of the murders and that she was a hostage the entire time. The police did not know what to believe. They had two people, each blaming the other. While Charles and Carol sat in jail, the police in Nebraska and Wyoming began the difficult work of investigating the crimes. They had to travel to all the places where bodies had been found. At the Bartlett house in Lincoln, investigators found the 3 bodies hidden in the outhouse and the chicken coop. They also found the note on the door that said, "Everybody's sick with the flu." This note became important evidence because it showed that someone had tried to hide what really happened inside the house. At the farm of August Meyer, police found the body of the old man and his dog. Near the storm cellar in Bennett, they found the bodies of Robert Jensen and Carol King. The teenagers had been shot and left in the cold. At the large home of the Ward family, the scene was even worse. Police found the bodies of Lillian Fenkel, Clara Ward, and Chester Lauer Ward in different parts of the house. They also found the dead dog. They found evidence that Charles and Carol had eaten food in the kitchen and had cut pictures of themselves out of the newspapers. These pictures were later found in the Packard car when Charles was arrested. The investigation moved quickly because Charles began to talk. After his first claim that Carol was innocent, he changed his story. He began to say that Carol was not a hostage at all. He said she was a willing partner who had helped him and even killed some of the victims herself. He specifically accused her of shooting Carol King and of shooting Merle Collison in Wyoming. He said she was excited by the violence and enjoyed it. The police recorded his statements and used them to build their case against both of them. The legal process began with extradition. Charles was wanted in Nebraska for multiple murders, so he was sent back to Lincoln to stand trial. Carol was also sent back. They arrived in Nebraska in late January and early February 1958. The public was outraged. Newspapers printed their pictures on the front page every day. People wanted justice for the 11 victims. The trials were going to be some of the most famous in Nebraska history. Charles Starkweather went to trial first. His trial began in May 1958. He was tried specifically for the murder of Robert Jensen, but the other murders were also discussed in court because they were all connected. The courtroom was crowded every day. Charles sat quietly, showing little emotion. His lawyers argued that he was insane, that he could not tell right from wrong because of a condition they called a diseased mind. They brought in doctors and psychologists who testified that Charles had a personality disorder and that he had felt rage and hatred since he was a child. The prosecution argued that Charles was not insane. They said he knew exactly what he was doing. They pointed to how he planned the robberies, how he hid the bodies, and how he ran from the police. They said this proved he knew his actions were wrong. The jury listened to all the evidence for 3 weeks. They heard from witnesses who knew Charles as a child. They heard from police officers who arrested him. They heard Charles's own words from his confessions. On May 23, 1958, after deliberating for about 22 hours, the jury returned with a verdict. They found Charles Starkweather guilty of first-degree murder. The judge then had to decide the punishment. In Nebraska at that time, first-degree murder could be punished by death in the electric chair. The judge asked Charles if he had anything to say before the sentence was given. Charles did not show any emotion. He said nothing. The judge sentenced him to die in the electric chair at the Nebraska State Penitentiary. Charles was taken away to death row to wait for his execution date. Carol and Fugate's trial began later in 1958 in November. It was a very different kind of trial. Carol was only 14 years old when the crimes happened, but she was being tried as an adult because of the seriousness of the charges. She was charged with first-degree murder as an accomplice, meaning the state said she helped Charles commit the crimes. Her lawyers argued that she was an innocent victim, a frightened girl who did what she was told because she was terrified that Charles would kill her too. The trial was dramatic. Charles was brought from death row to testify against her. He looked at her from the witness stand and told the court that she had been with him willingly. He said she had shot Carole King and Merle Collison. He said she never tried to escape and that she enjoyed the whole thing. Carole took the stand in her own defense. She cried as she told the jury that she had come home to find her family already dead. She said Charles pointed a gun at her and told her that if she did not go with him, he would kill her too. She said she stayed with him because she was afraid and had nowhere to go. The prosecution pointed to evidence that hurt Carole's story. They showed that she had been seen in stores with Charles, buying food and supplies. They showed that she had been in the ward house for a long time and had never tried to run away or call for help. They pointed to the newspaper pictures she had cut out and kept, which showed her own dead family. The prosecution argued that an innocent hostage would not do these things. They said she was a willing participant who only claimed to be a hostage after she was caught. The jury had to decide who was telling the truth. They deliberated for a long time. Finally, on November 21st, 1958, they returned with their verdict. They found Carole and Fugate guilty of first-degree murder. Because she was so young, she was not sentenced to death. Instead, the judge sentenced her to life in prison. She was taken to the Nebraska Correctional Center for Women in York, Nebraska, to begin serving her sentence. Back in Lincoln, Charles Starkweather waited on death row. He spent over a year there. During that time, he wrote letters to his family. In one letter, he told his father that he was not really sorry for what he had done. He said that for the first time in his life, he and Carole had fun. He seemed to accept his fate. He did not fight against it. He told people that he believed he was supposed to die. The date of his execution was set for June 25th, 1959. On the night before, Charles ate his last meal and spoke with a prison chaplain. He showed no fear. He gave no last words. He was led to the electric chair just after midnight. At 12:04 a.m. on June 25th, 1959, the execution was carried out. Charles Raymond Starkweather was pronounced dead. There was a strange event just before the execution. The doctor who was supposed to examine Charles and declare him dead, a man named B.A. Finkel, suffered a fatal heart attack in the prison about 30 minutes before Charles was put in the electric chair. Another doctor had to be found to perform the duty. Despite this, the execution went forward as planned. Charles's body was taken to Weucha Cemetery in Lincoln. He was buried there in an unmarked grave. It was the same cemetery where 5 of his victims, including the Ward family, were also buried. Carole and Fugate remained in prison for many years. She was a model prisoner. She stayed out of trouble and did what she was told. Over time, people began to question whether she should have been convicted. Some believed her story that she was a hostage. Others still believed she was guilty. After she had served 17.5 years in prison, the parole board reviewed her case. In June 1976, she was granted parole and released from prison. She was 32 years old. She left Nebraska and moved to Michigan, where she started a new life under a different name. She rarely spoke about the past. The 11 victims of Charles Starkweather and the crimes committed with Carole and Fugate were remembered by their families and communities. Robert Calvert, Marion Bartlett, Velda Bartlett, Betty Jean Bartlett, August Meyer, Robert Jensen, Carole King, Lillian Fenkel, Clara Ward, Chester Lauer Ward, and Merle Collison all lost their lives in a span of just over 2 months. Their deaths shocked the nation and changed the way people thought about violence in young people. The case became one of the first great crime stories of the modern era, studied by criminologists and psychologists who wanted to understand what makes a person become a killer. The story of Charles Starkweather and Carole and Fugate, which began in the poor neighborhoods of Lincoln, ended on that summer morning in 1959, with one of them dead and the other beginning a long life behind bars. Story 2. Bobby Joe Long was born on October 14, 1953, in a small river town called Canova, which is located in the state of West Virginia. His parents were Joe Long and Louetta Long. From the very beginning of his life, there were factors that would make his childhood different from most other children's. When he was born, doctors observed that he had a rare medical condition. He was born with an extra sex chromosome. Most males are born with an XY chromosome pattern, but Bobby was born with an XXY pattern. This condition is known as Klinefelter syndrome. A direct result of this condition was that his body did not produce testosterone in a typical way. Instead, it produced higher levels of estrogen, which is a female hormone. As Bobby grew from a baby into a young boy, the effects of this condition began to show on his body. While other boys his age were developing flat chests, Bobby's chest began to develop differently. He started to grow breast tissue, a trait that is normal for girls but very unusual for boys. This physical difference became a central part of his childhood experience. When he reached school age, the other children noticed that he looked different. They were cruel to him, as children can sometimes be. They teased him mercilessly and made fun of his chest. They called him names that hurt his feelings deeply. He felt ashamed of his own body and felt like an outsider who did not belong with the other boys. This teasing went on for years and caused him a great deal of emotional pain. To make matters worse for his physical health, Bobby was also involved in several accidents when he was a child. He suffered multiple injuries to his head during these different incidents. While these injuries were treated at the time, they were serious enough to be noted in his medical history. The combination of his unusual hormonal condition and these repeated head traumas created a complex and difficult physical foundation for his life. His home life was also very troubled and complicated. Bobby's relationship with his mother, Louetta, was not normal or healthy for a growing boy. For much of his childhood, he did not sleep in his own bed. Instead, he slept in the same bed as his mother, and this continued until he was well into his teenage years. This situation created a deeply confusing and inappropriate bond between them. On top of this, his mother worked a job that kept her out late at night. When she would come home in the late hours, she would often bring with her different men she was dating. These were short-term boyfriends who would come and go. Young Bobby witnessed this pattern of his mother with different men repeatedly. He grew to resent these men for being in his home, and he also grew to resent his mother for her behavior. He felt a deep sense of anger and confusion about the women in his life, starting with his mother. As he moved into adolescence, the physical problem with his chest became unbearable for him. The constant teasing and his own self-hatred over his appearance led him to seek a permanent solution. When he was a teenager, he underwent a surgical procedure known as a breast reduction. This surgery removed the excess breast tissue and made his chest look more like a normal male chest. While this fixed the physical problem, it did not erase the years of shame and bullying he had already endured. The emotional scars from that time remained with him. Despite the difficulties of his early life, Bobby had a somewhat normal social life in one way. He met a girl in high school, and they began a romantic relationship. She became his girlfriend. This relationship was a constant for him during his later teenage years. After they both finished high school, they made the decision to get married. In 1974, Bobby and his high school girlfriend became husband and wife. For a time, they tried to build a normal family life together. They had 2 children, and Bobby became a father. On the surface, he was a married man with a job and a family. However, the problems that had been building inside him for years were beginning to surface in his behavior at home. Behind the closed doors of their home, Bobby's wife began to experience a very different side of him. Their marriage was not happy or peaceful. He was abusive toward her in multiple ways. He was physically violent, and he also forced her into sexual acts that she did not want. This behavior went on for several years. His wife endured this abuse while trying to raise their 2 children. Finally, she could not take it any longer. In 1980, after 6 years of marriage, she filed the legal papers to end their marriage. In the court documents, she stated clearly that the reason for the divorce was the physical abuse and the sexual abuse she had suffered at his hands. The marriage was dissolved, and this was another major event in Bobby's life, showing a clear pattern of violence against women. He had now lost his wife and his daily life with his children. After the divorce, Bobby's life began to change direction. He did not stay in the area where he had grown up. Instead, he decided to move to a completely different part of Florida. In 1983, he relocated to the Tampa Bay area, a large region on the west coast of Florida that includes the cities of Tampa and St. Petersburg. He was a man in his late 20s, living alone in a new place, with a history of childhood trauma, a serious medical condition, brain injuries, a deeply troubled relationship with his mother, and a failed marriage that ended because he was a violent and abusive husband. He was living in a new city, but he carried all of this history with him. Bobby Joe Long was now living alone in the Tampa Bay area. He had moved there in 1983, but he was not a man who was trying to build a quiet or peaceful life. Shortly after his arrival in Florida, his violent behavior continued. He committed an assault against a woman, and this led to him being arrested and put on probation. This means he was allowed to stay out of prison as long as he followed certain rules and did not get into any more trouble. But Bobby did not follow the rules of his probation. Instead, his behavior grew much darker and much more dangerous. In March of 1984, only a few months after moving to the area, Bobby committed his first known murder. The victim was a young woman named Artis Wick. She was 20 years old, and people who knew her called her Anne, and had traveled a long way to get to Florida. She had left her home in Gas City, Indiana, and had hitchhiked all the way to Tampa. Hitchhiking means she stood on the side of the road and asked strangers for rides in their cars to get her where she needed to go. This was a dangerous thing to do, especially for a young woman alone, and had plans for her future. She was engaged to be married. She was in Tampa, and one day she got into a car with the wrong person. That person was Bobby Joe Long. He did not just give her a ride. He raped her, and then he strangled her, which means he squeezed her neck until she could not breathe and died. After he killed her, he took her body and left it in a rural area, a place far out in the countryside where he thought no one would find her. Her body lay there for many months, undiscovered. Even before Anne's body was found, Bobby was committing other attacks. He was not just killing women, he was also attacking them in their own homes. One of his victims during this time was a 33-year-old woman named Linda Nuttall. Bobby went to her home, got inside, and attacked her. He raped her. This showed that he was willing to take very big risks. He would go into a woman's private space, where she was supposed to be safe, and assault her there. This attack on Linda Nuttall was another crime that added to his growing pattern of violence. As the months went on through 1984, Bobby continued to kill. He murdered woman after woman. The victims were all young. Their names were Nen Long, who was called Lana, and she was 19. Michelle Sims was 22. Elizabeth Loudenbach was 22. Chanel Williams was only 18. Karen Dinsfriend was 28. Kimberly Hops was 22. Virginia Johnson was 18. Kim Swan was 21. Vicki Elliott was 21. These women had their whole lives ahead of them. They were daughters, sisters, and friends. They lived in the Tampa Bay area, and they crossed paths with Bobby Joe Long. He would approach them or capture them, and then he would sexually assault them and kill them. He would then leave their bodies in different locations, often in remote or rural spots. The police in different cities and counties were finding the bodies of these young women, and they did not know at first that they were all looking for the same man. The murders seemed connected, but the connection was not yet clear. The way Bobby committed these crimes followed a pattern. Many of the victims were found with fibers on their bodies. These were tiny threads that came from a carpet. The fibers were a specific color red. They had come from inside Bobby's car. When he put the women in his vehicle, the red fibers from the carpet would stick to their clothing or their hair. This was a piece of evidence he did not know he was leaving behind. He also used rope to tie up his victims, and he tied the rope in certain types of knots. The way he tied the knots was the same in many cases. This was another clue that the same person was committing all these crimes. Then came the night of November 3rd, 1984. This was the night that would eventually lead to Bobby being caught. A 17-year-old girl named Lisa McVeigh was working her shift at a donut shop. She rode her bicycle to and from work because she did not have a car. After her shift ended, late in the evening, she got on her bike and started riding home. It was dark outside. As she was riding, a car pulled up near her. A man got out. It was Bobby Joe Long. He grabbed her, forced her off her bike, and made her get into his car. He put a blindfold over her eyes so she could not see where they were going. He drove her to his home. Once they were inside his house, Bobby began to assault Lisa. He raped her repeatedly over many hours. Lisa was terrified, but she was also very smart and very brave. Even though she could not see because of the blindfold, she was paying close attention to everything. She was trying to survive, and she was thinking ahead. She knew that she might not make it out of this situation alive. She also knew that if she did die, she wanted to leave clues behind so the police could find the man who did this to her. So while she was in his house, she touched things on purpose. She put her fingers on surfaces like tables and counters, pressing down hard so she would leave her fingerprints behind. She touched as many different things as she could, building up a trail of evidence without Bobby knowing it. She also used her other senses to learn about him. While she was blindfolded, she listened carefully to every sound. She paid attention to how long they drove. She noticed that at one point, Bobby stopped the car and used an automatic teller machine, or ATM. She heard the sounds the machine made. She noted this moment in her mind. She was building a mental map of his movements. She was also listening to his voice and trying to remember any details he might let slip. Bobby held Lisa captive in his home for 26 hours. He continued to assault her during this time. Then, for a reason that is not fully known, he decided to let her go. He drove her to a location and released her. He told her not to go to the police, but Lisa had no intention of following that order. As soon as she was free, she went directly to the authorities. She went to the police station and told them everything that had happened to her. Because she had kept her mind sharp and paid attention to every detail during her horrific ordeal, she was able to give the police a wealth of information. She described the inside of his home as best she could. She described the car she had been in. Most importantly, she told them about the stop at the ATM. She gave them a time frame for when that stop happened. This was a crucial piece of information. The police could now check bank records for that specific time and see which account was used. This led them directly to a name and an address. The name on the account was Bobby Joe Long. The police now had a suspect. While Lisa was giving her statement to the police, other investigators were working on the many murder cases. They had collected evidence from the bodies of the dead women. They had the red carpet fibers. They had photographs and reports. They did not yet know who the killer was, but they had a lot of physical clues. On November 16, 1984, just 2 weeks after Lisa McVeigh was released, the police made their move. They had identified Bobby Joe Long as the man who had abducted and raped Lisa. They found out that he was at a movie theater. Police officers went to the theater and arrested him. He was taken into custody and brought to the police station for questioning. He was initially charged with the kidnapping and sexual assault of Lisa McVeigh. When the detectives sat down with him, Bobby agreed to talk. He signed a paper, known as a Miranda waiver, which meant he gave up his right to remain silent and his right to have a lawyer present during questioning. He began by confessing to what he had done to Lisa McVeigh. He told them all about taking her from her bicycle and holding her in his home. This confession was the first step, but the detectives in the room knew that this man might be connected to something much bigger. They had a room full of files on unsolved murders, and they were ready to ask him about them. After Bobby Joe Long finished confessing to the kidnapping and rape of Lisa McVeigh, the detectives in the interrogation room did not end the questioning. They had a larger goal in mind. They had been investigating a series of murders of young women for many months, and they strongly suspected that the man sitting in front of them was responsible. They changed the focus of the conversation. They began to ask him about the dead women whose bodies had been found in the Tampa Bay area. They wanted to know if he had killed them. As the detectives started asking these new questions, Bobby's behavior in the room began to change. He became less willing to talk. When they asked him directly about the unsolved murders, he did not confess right away. Instead, he tried to avoid answering. He told the detectives, "I'd rather not answer that." This was his way of trying to stop the conversation about the killings. But the detectives did not stop. They continued to press him for answers. They wanted to break down his resistance and get him to tell the truth about what he had done. The detectives then used a different tactic to get him to talk. They brought out photographs. They placed pictures of the murder victims in front of him on the table. They showed him the faces of the young women who had been killed. They watched his reaction as he looked at these images. Seeing the photographs of the women he had murdered seemed to have a strong effect on him. He realized that the police had connected him to these deaths. He understood that the situation he was in had become much more serious than just the charges for attacking Lisa McVeigh. He looked at the detectives and said, "The complexion of things sure have changed since you came back into the room. I think I need an attorney." This was a clear request for a lawyer. He was asking for his legal right to have someone there to protect him. However, the detectives did not stop the interrogation at that moment. They did not provide him with an attorney. They continued to question him about the murders. Under this continued pressure, Bobby eventually began to confess. He started talking about the women he had killed. He gave them details about 8 murders that had happened in Hillsborough County, which is where Tampa is located. He also confessed to one murder that had happened in the nearby county called Pasco County. He told them how he had done it, and he confirmed that he was the man they had been looking for. This confession was a major breakthrough for the police, who had been working on these cases for nearly a year. But the police did not rely only on Bobby's words to prove he was the killer. They had strong physical evidence as well. The FBI had a team of experts who analyzed evidence from crimes. They looked closely at the tiny red carpet fibers that had been found on the bodies of so many of the victims. They compared those fibers to the carpet inside Bobby Joe Long's vehicle. The fibers were a perfect match. This was scientific proof that those women had been inside his car. This evidence connected him directly to the murders in a way that could not be argued against in court. The fibers were found on most of his victims, making the case against him extremely strong. Now that the police had both a confession and physical evidence, the legal process began. Bobby Joe Long was officially charged with multiple counts of murder, as well as the kidnapping and rape of Lisa McVeigh. He was facing the possibility of the death penalty. His case went to court, and the two sides, the prosecutors and the defense lawyers, began to negotiate. The prosecutors were the lawyers working for the state, trying to put him in prison. The defense lawyers were from the public defender's office, and their job was to represent Bobby and try to get him the best outcome possible, even though he had confessed to terrible crimes. On September 24th, 1985, they reached an agreement called a plea bargain. In this agreement, Bobby Joe Long pleaded guilty to 8 of the murders. He also pleaded guilty to the abduction and rape of Lisa McVeigh. In exchange for his guilty pleas, he was given a large number of life sentences. He received 26 life sentences without the possibility of parole. This meant he would never be released from prison for those crimes. Most of these sentences would run at the same time, but 2 of them were ordered to be served one after the other. This ensured he would stay in prison forever. He also received 7 more life sentences, but for these he would have the chance to be considered for parole after 25 years. However, the most important part of the plea bargain was that the state of Florida kept the right to seek the death penalty for one specific murder. That murder was the killing of a young woman named Michelle Denise Sims. The case for the murder of Michelle Sims went to a separate trial. In July of 1986, a jury found Bobby Joe Long guilty of her murder. After hearing all the evidence, the judge sentenced him to die. The sentence was death by lethal injection. He was sent to death row to wait for his execution date. However, the legal process was far from over. Bobby and his lawyers filed many appeals over the following decades. An appeal is a request to a higher court to review the case and look for legal mistakes. One of these appeals was successful. The court looked at the murder conviction for a victim named Virginia Johnson. The judges decided that there had been problems with how that case was handled. As a result, his conviction for killing Virginia Johnson was reversed, and he was acquitted, which means he was found not guilty of that specific murder. This did not set him free, because he was still convicted of so many other murders, but it showed how complicated the legal system can be. For more than 30 years, Bobby Joe Long sat on death row. He waited while his lawyers filed appeal after appeal to try to stop his execution. For many years, these appeals worked, and he was given one delay after another. During this time, the families of his victims had to live with the knowledge that their daughter's killer was still alive. They waited for justice to be fully carried out. Lisa McVeigh, the teenager who had survived his attack, grew up and became an adult. She dedicated her life to helping others and became a speaker and a deputy sheriff, using her terrible experience to educate people about survival and justice. Finally, in 2019, the process came to an end. On April 23, 2019, the new governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, signed a document called a death warrant for Bobby Joe Long. This was the official order to schedule his execution. It was the first death warrant the new governor had signed. Bobby's lawyers made one last attempt to stop it, but their appeals were all denied. The date was set for May 23, 2019. On the morning of his execution day, Bobby Joe Long was given his final meal. He requested a meal of roast beef, bacon, French fries, and a soda. He ate this meal at 9:30 in the morning. As the day went on, he was prepared for the procedure. When he was asked if he wanted to make a final statement, he chose to say nothing. At 7 o'clock in the evening, he was led into the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. He was strapped to a gurney, and needles were inserted into his veins. The lethal drugs began to flow into his body. A few minutes later, at 7 p.m., Bobby Joe Long was pronounced dead. More than 30 years after he terrorized the Tampa Bay area and took the lives of 10 women, the sentence was finally carried out. His body was taken away, and the case of Bobby Joe Long was officially closed. Story 3. Earl Leonard Nelson was born on May 12, 1897, in the city of San Francisco, California. When he came into the world, his last name was not Nelson, but Farrell. His full name at birth was Earl Leonard Farrell. His father was a man named James Carlos Farrell, and his mother was named Frances Nelson. His mother's family had roots in Denmark and Ireland. Earl did not have a chance to know his parents. Both his father and his mother became very sick with a disease called syphilis. This was a serious illness at that time, and there was no cure for it. Because of this disease, both of his parents died before Earl had even reached the age of 2. He was left without a mother or a father when he was just a baby. After his parents died, there was no one to take care of baby Earl except his mother's mother, his grandmother. Her name was Jenny Nelson. Earl went to live with her in San Francisco. Jenny Nelson was a very religious woman. She was a devoted member of a strict Christian group called the Pentecostals. She believed in the Bible completely and lived her life by its rules. In her home, religion was the most important thing. Besides Earl, Jenny also had two of her own younger children living in the house. Their names were Willis and Lillian. They were Earl's aunt and uncle, even though they were much older than him. Willis was 10 years older than Earl, and Lillian was 8 years older. So, Earl grew up in a house with his grandmother, who was strict and religious, and two much older children who were like an older brother and sister to him. Even when he was a very young boy, people noticed that Earl was different from other children. He did things that were strange and worrying. He seemed to have a deep dislike for himself, which is called self-loathing. He also acted in ways that doctors would later call morbid, meaning he was often focused on sad or gloomy things. His behavior was so unusual that when he was just 7 years old, he was expelled from his primary school, the Agassiz Primary School in San Francisco. They did not want him there anymore because of the way he acted. When Earl was about 10 years old, something very serious happened to him. He was riding his bicycle when he rode right into the path of a streetcar. The streetcar hit him, and the accident was very bad. He hit his head and was knocked unconscious. He did not wake up for 6 entire days. His family and doctors must have been very worried. When he finally woke up, things were different. The accident had changed him. He started having very bad headaches all the time. He also began to forget things, suffering from memory loss. His behavior, which was already strange, became even more erratic and hard to predict. As Earl grew from a boy into a teenager, his behavior became more and more bizarre. He would have conversations with people who were not there, talking to imaginary figures. He would also compulsively recite long passages from the Bible, over and over again, which was likely a result of his grandmother's strong influence. Another strange and troubling behavior was that he would secretly watch his female family members, like his Aunt Lillian, when they were undressing. His grandmother also noticed something very odd. Sometimes, Earl would leave for school in the morning wearing clean, freshly washed clothes. But when he came home in the afternoon, he would be wearing old, torn rags. It was as if he had found a homeless person on the street and traded clothes with them. No one knew why he did this. When he got a little older, in his early teenage years, Earl started to go to a part of San Francisco called the Barbary Coast. This was a dangerous area known for its bars and houses where men could pay women for sex, which were called brothels. He began spending time in these places. Because of this, he caught a disease that is passed through sex, which is called a venereal disease. As his body changed during puberty, Earl grew into a strong and stocky young man. He was not tall, but he was physically very fit and powerful. He would sometimes show off for his family by doing tricks, like walking on his hands or lifting very heavy objects by gripping them with his teeth. They would watch him and be amazed by his strength. Earl did not go to school for very long. His formal education ended early, and he had to find ways to make money. He worked at different jobs, but he did not stay at any of them for a long time. When he was a young man, he started getting into trouble with the law. These were small crimes at first, but they were the beginning of his life as a criminal. He was arrested for the first time for minor offenses. The most serious of his early crimes happened in 1915, when he was 18 years old. He broke into a small cabin in a rural area called Plumas County. He later claimed he thought the cabin was abandoned, but he was caught and sent to a famous state prison called San Quentin. He was sentenced to 2 years there. He was let out early on parole in September 1916. But just a few months later, in March 1917, he was arrested again in the city of Stockton for stealing small items, which is called petty larceny. He spent another 6 months in jail for that. After he got out, he went to Los Angeles. There, he was arrested once more, this time for burglary, which means breaking into a building to steal things. He was put in the Los Angeles County Jail for about 5 months. But Ole did not stay there. He managed to escape. Later in 1917, with the country fighting in World War I, Ole decided to join the United States military. He joined one of the branches, but he did not like it. After only 6 weeks, he left without permission, which is called deserting. He did this more than once. He would join a different branch of the military, sometimes using a fake name, and then desert after a short time. Finally, in 1918, his strange behavior caught up with him while he was in the Navy. He was acting so oddly that the Navy sent him to a mental hospital. This was the Napa State Mental Hospital, a large place for people with mental illnesses. When he arrived, a psychologist talked to him and noted that he did not seem violent or dangerous at that moment. But another doctor, a psychiatrist named William Pritchard, had a longer talk with him. Earl told the doctor about strange things he experienced. He said he saw faces that were not there and heard music that no one else could hear. He also had paranoid thoughts, believing that people were trying to poison him. He told the doctor that voices sometimes whispered to him, telling him to kill himself. He also said that if he were kept in a jail cell, he would find something sharp and cut the veins in his wrists. Dr. Pritchard also noticed that Ole complained of bad headaches at the back of his head, that he sometimes fainted, and that he felt dizzy. While he was in the Napa hospital, Ole showed that he was very good at escaping. He got out at least 3 times. The people who worked at the hospital were so impressed by his ability to escape that they gave him a nickname. They called him Houdini, after the famous magician and escape artist. Even though he kept escaping, the hospital eventually stopped trying to find him. In May 1919, the Navy officially discharged him, even though he was not there. The hospital closed his file, writing a note that said he had improved. After leaving the hospital for good, Ole needed a job. He got one as a janitor at a place called St. Mary's Hospital in San Francisco. He used a fake name, Evan Lewis Fuller, to get the job. At this hospital, he met a woman named Mary Martin. She was 60 years old and worked in the hospital's administrative office. They started to spend time together and began dating. To the surprise of many, they got married in August 1919. But the marriage was a disaster from the start. Earl's true nature came out. He had terrible fits of jealousy for no reason. He made strange and upsetting sexual requests. He would talk obsessively about his religious delusions, and he became more and more violent. Mary later said that he made her life a living hell. They only lived together as husband and wife for 6 months before Mary could not take it anymore and left him. Even after such a short time together, Mary would later remember odd things about him. He would disappear from their home for long periods without explanation. He also had very strange bathing habits. He would sit and pour individual glasses of water over his toes, one by one, instead of taking a normal bath or shower. Years later, in 1921, Ole committed another serious crime. On May 19th, he dressed up as a plumber and went to a house in San Francisco. He tricked his way inside. A 12-year-old girl named Mary Summers was there. Ole tried to take her down to the basement and molest her, but the girl was smart and brave. She screamed as loudly as she could. Her 9-year-old brother heard her and came running to help. Ole got scared and ran away. He escaped, but not for long. A few hours later, he was caught while riding a trolley car. Because of this crime, he was taken to court. The court decided he was dangerous. He was sent back to the Napa State Mental Hospital. He would escape 2 more times while he was there, but they always brought him back. He stayed in the hospital for a few more years. Finally, in 1925, the hospital decided to let him go for good. He was discharged and set free back into the world. In the year 1926, About 1 year after he was released from the Napa State Mental Hospital for the last time, Ole Nelson began a series of terrible crimes. He started killing women. He was living in San Francisco again, and he had a clear plan for how he would find his victims. He would look in the newspapers for small advertisements placed by women who had a room to rent in their house. These women were often called landladies. They would rent out a spare bedroom to strangers to make some extra money. Nelson saw this as his way to get inside their homes. On February 20th, 1926, Nelson went to a boarding house at 2037 Pierce Street in San Francisco. A boarding house is a large home where several people rent rooms. The woman who ran this house was named Clara Newman. She was 60 years old and had some money. Nelson knocked on her door and introduced himself as a potential tenant. He said his name was Roger Wilson. He acted polite and friendly. Clara Newman led him inside to show him the room that was for rent. This was her mistake. Once he was inside and alone with her, Nelson attacked her. He used his strong hands to strangle her, which means he squeezed her neck until she could not breathe and died. After she was dead, he committed a sexual act on her body. This is called necrophilia. Then, he hid her body in an empty apartment inside the same building so no one would find it right away. This was his first known murder. Just over a week later, on March 2nd, Nelson traveled to a city south of San Francisco called San Jose. There, he found another victim. Her name was Laura Beale, and she was 63 years old. He used the same trick. He went to her home, likely pretending to want to rent a room. He strangled her to death. This time, he used a thin, strong cord, like a piece of rope or string, to choke her. He wrapped it around her neck so tightly that it cut into her skin. After killing her, he again committed necrophilia and then left her body in the house. For a few months, the murders stopped. But on June 26th, Nelson killed again in San Francisco. His victim was Lillian St. Mary, who was 63 years old. He strangled her and then raped her dead body. Exactly 2 weeks later, on July 10th, he was far to the south in the city of Santa Barbara. There, he went to the boarding house of a 53-year-old woman named Ollie Russell. He strangled her with a cord and sexually assaulted her after she was dead. The police in Santa Barbara did an autopsy, which is a doctor's examination of a dead body. They found out she had been attacked after death. They also noticed that the way she was killed was very similar to the murders in the San Francisco area. They started to think these crimes might be connected, but they did not know who was doing it. Nelson continued his killing. On August 16th, he was in Oakland, a city near San Francisco. He went to an apartment building run by a 52-year-old woman named Mary Nisbet. He got inside and strangled her in the bathroom of an empty apartment. He then raped her. Her husband found her body later. The police first suspected the husband might have killed her, but they soon realized he was not responsible. People who lived nearby told police they had seen a stranger hanging around the building on the day Mary died. They described him as a dark-haired man who was stocky and strong, with long arms and large hands. Because of these descriptions, newspapers started calling the unknown killer the Dark Strangler, or the Gorilla Man. In the fall, around October, Nelson left California and went north to Portland, Oregon. He continued his pattern there. On October 19th, he went to the home of a 35-year-old landlady named Beata Withers. He strangled her and raped her dead body. Then he did something different to hide her. He stuffed her body inside a large steamer trunk in the attic of her own house. Her teenage son found her there days later. The very next day, October 20th, Nelson killed again in Portland. This victim was Virginia Grant, a 59-year-old woman who owned some property. He strangled her in a vacant house she owned and hid her body behind the furnace in the basement. The day after that, on October 21st, a landlady named Mabel Fluke disappeared from her home. A few days later, her body was found in her own attic. She had been strangled with a scarf. After killing 3 women in just 3 days in Portland, Nelson briefly went back to San Francisco. On November 18th, he went to the home of a 56-year-old widow named Anna Edmonds. He strangled her with a rag and raped her. A friend of Anna's later told police that she had visited Anna on the day she died. The friend said Anna was talking to a strange man in her living room about selling her house. The friend's description of the man matched the dark strangler exactly. The very next day, November 19th, Nelson tried to kill again, but this time he failed. He went to a house in a town called Burlingame, near San Francisco. The woman living there was 28 years old and was pregnant. She was showing him her home because he was pretending to be a buyer. He was acting polite, but she later realized he kept asking her to look up at the ceilings. She understood later that he was trying to get her to look away, so he could get behind her and grab her throat. She felt something was wrong and managed to get away or fight him off. She survived the attack. She told police he was well-dressed and spoke well, about 5 feet 8 inches tall. 10 days later, on November 29th, Nelson was back in Portland. He killed a woman named Blanche Myers in her home. He strangled and raped her. When the police examined the crime scene, they found fingerprints on her iron bedpost. These were the first physical clues he had left behind. The murders in Portland were causing panic. The police station was flooded with phone calls from scared citizens reporting any suspicious man they saw. One woman called police to tell them about a man named Adrian Harris, who had stayed in her boarding house. He had left on November 29th, the same day Blanche Myers was killed. Before he left, he gave her and another woman some jewelry as gifts. The police looked at the jewelry and discovered it had belonged to a wealthy woman named Florence Monks. Florence Monks had been murdered and raped in her home in Seattle, Washington, on November 23rd. Nelson had stolen her jewelry and then given it away. The police in California and Oregon were very worried. They told the public, especially older women, to be careful. They advised women never to show their rooms to strangers while they were alone. They said it was better to call a policeman to be there. But Nelson had already left Portland. He was moving east. In late November and December, Nelson traveled across the country. He hitchhiked or hid on trains to move from place to place. On December 23rd, he was in Council Bluffs, Iowa. He killed a 41-year-old woman named Almira Burrard. He strangled her with a shirt and raped her. At first, the local police thought she had killed herself because she had recently been in a mental hospital. But then they found out she had been raped, so they knew it was murder. 2 days after Christmas, on December 27th, Nelson was in Kansas City, Missouri. He killed a 23-year-old woman named Bonnie Pace in her home. He strangled and raped her. Her husband found her body. The very next day, December 28th, Nelson struck again in Kansas City. This time, he went to the home of a 28-year-old woman named Germania Harpin. He strangled her and raped her dead body. But this time, there was someone else in the home. Germania's baby son, Robert, was there. He was only 8 months old. Nelson strangled the baby too. He used a diaper to choke the little boy to death. This was the only time Nelson killed a man or a young child. After Kansas City, Nelson continued east. The next murder the police linked to him happened on April 27, 1927, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The victim was Mary McConnell, a 53-year-old landlady. He strangled and raped her. He also stole some jewelry from her house, including a gold watch. The next day, he tried to sell that watch to a pawn shop owner named Marie Kuhn, but she did not buy it. About a month later, on May 27th, Nelson arrived in Buffalo, New York. He rented a room from a 53-year-old woman named Jenny Randolph. He used the fake name Charles Harrison. 3 days later, on May 30th, Jenny Randolph was found dead in her home. She had been strangled and raped, and her body was stuffed under a bed. A man who lived in the house and Jenny's own brother had both met Mr. Harrison and were able to describe him to the police. On June 1st, Nelson was in Detroit, Michigan. He went to a boarding house run by a woman named Fannie Mae. There, he killed Fannie Mae and also a woman who lived in the house, Maureen Aderthy. He strangled Fannie Mae by cutting an electrical cord from a lamp and using it as a garrote. The police noticed that the cord had been cut while the electricity was still on, which would have left burn marks on the knife he used. 2 days later, on June 3rd, Nelson was in Chicago, Illinois. He killed a 27-year-old woman named Mary Sietsma. Her husband found her on the floor of their home, strangled with another appliance cord. Some men's clothing was also missing from the house. Nelson's next move was north, across the border into Canada. He went to Winnipeg, in the province of Manitoba. On June 8, 1927, a 14-year-old girl named Lola Cowan left her home to sell artificial flowers door to door. She never came back. She had disappeared. On June 10th, another woman in Winnipeg, a 27-year-old named Emily Patterson, also went missing. Her husband found her later that evening. She was dead, stuffed under her son's bed. She had been strangled, raped, and also hit in the head with a hammer. Her husband found her body when he knelt down by the bed to say his prayers. Several items were missing from the Patterson home. A suit, Emily's gold wedding ring, the family Bible, and $70 in cash were all gone. The police also found a knife at the scene that had burn marks and nicks on the blade. It was the same kind of knife that would have been used to cut the live electrical cord in Detroit. The day after Emily Patterson was killed, a jeweler in Winnipeg named Fred England bought a gold wedding ring from a man for a small amount of money. It was Emily Patterson's ring. Also, some of the clothing stolen from her home showed up for sale in a second-hand store nearby. A barber named Nicholas Tabor, who had a shop next to that store, told police a strange story. He said he had given a man a shave, a haircut, and a massage on the afternoon of June 10th. While cutting the man's hair, the barber noticed dried blood on his scalp and some scratch marks. When the barber asked about them, the man got upset and told him not to touch them. The police in Winnipeg began searching all the boarding houses in the city. On June 12th, they went to a house on Smith Street, where a woman named Mrs. August Hill ran a boarding house. They searched the room of a man who had been staying there. Under the bed, they made a horrible discovery. They found the dead body of Lola Cowan, the 14-year-old girl who had disappeared. Her body was decaying, and she was nude. The police could tell that the man had slept in the bed, right above the body of the girl he had killed. It was clear that Nelson had murdered Lola Cowan, hidden her body, and then continued to live in the room as if nothing had happened. The police now knew they were looking for a monster. They sent his description to every police station in the United States. Nelson had already fled from the boarding house. He was trying to get back to the United States. On June 14th, a man matching his description was arrested by customs officers in a small border town called Warroad in Minnesota. He was using the name Mike Moski, but he managed to escape from the jail there the very next day. 2 days later, on June 16, 1927, constables in another small Manitoba town near the border, called Killarney, arrested a man who gave his name as Virgil Wilson. He was calm and cooperative, so the constables thought they had the wrong man. They put him in the local jail, but he escaped that same evening. He made a mistake, though. He tried to catch a train that was also carrying the very police officers who were hunting for him from Winnipeg. They recognized him and arrested him again, just 12 hours after he had escaped. This time, he was taken to the main police station in Winnipeg, where they took his photograph and his fingerprints. The police in San Francisco sent his old fingerprints, and they matched perfectly. The man calling himself Virgil Wilson was Earl Nelson. He was finally in custody, and he would have to answer for the terrible things he had done. After Earl Nelson was brought to the main police station in Winnipeg, the city where he had committed his last 2 murders, the real work of proving his crimes began. He was sitting in a small, plain cell. He still insisted that his name was Virgil Wilson and that he was an innocent man. But the police had ways to find out the truth. They took his fingerprints right there in the station. Then, they sent a message by telegraph to the police department in San Francisco, California. They asked the San Francisco police to send back the fingerprint records they had for Ole Nelson from his old arrests. When the reply came, the officers in Winnipeg compared the two sets of prints. They were a perfect match. The man in their cell was not Virgil Wilson. He was Earl Nelson, a man with a long history of mental hospitals and crime. The fingerprints were proof. This was the first solid fact that linked him to his crimes in a way he could not deny. With his true identity confirmed, the police could now connect him to the murders in a more powerful way. They set up identification lineups. In a lineup, several men stand together, and witnesses are brought in to see if they can pick out the person they saw before. Nearly 4,000 people crowded the streets outside the police station, hoping to see the man the newspapers were calling a monster. Inside, witness after witness was brought before Nelson. The barber from Winnipeg, who had seen the blood on his scalp, picked him out. The jeweler who had bought Emily Patterson's wedding ring picked him out. The woman from the boarding house in Portland who had received the stolen jewelry as a gift was brought in, and she identified him. People from different cities, different states, and different countries all looked at Earl Nelson and said the same thing. That is the man. The evidence was building up like a wall around him. The police also found more physical clues. They looked at the marks on the bodies of the victims. They compared these marks to Nelson's teeth. They matched. They looked at the knives and other items left behind at crime scenes. The fingerprint evidence from Blanche Meyer's bedpost in Portland was compared to Nelson's fingerprints. They matched too. The case against him was becoming very strong. Even though there were so many murders across the United States, the authorities in Canada decided to try him first for the two murders he had committed in Winnipeg. The murder of 14-year-old Lola Cowan and the murder of 27-year-old Emily Patterson. He was also charged with other crimes like trying to molest a child and burglary, but the main focus was on the killings. Nelson's trial was supposed to begin at the end of June 1927, but his lawyer asked for more time to prepare. It was delayed until the fall. Finally, on November 1st, 1927, the trial began inside the Winnipeg Law Courts building, a large and serious place. The courtroom was filled with people, including reporters from newspapers all over North America. The man in charge of proving Nelson was guilty was a prosecutor named R.B. Graham. The judge overseeing the trial was Justice Andrew Dysart. Nelson's lawyer, a man named James H. Stitt, had been appointed by the court to defend him. This was his job, to make sure Nelson got a fair trial. The trial lasted for several days. More than 60 people came to the courtroom to speak as witnesses. Some of these witnesses had traveled a long way from the United States. They told the jury what they had seen. They placed Nelson at the scenes of the crimes. They told about the stolen property he had tried to sell or give away. The evidence was presented fact by fact, piece by piece. One of the most important witnesses was Nelson's own ex-wife, Mary Martin. She traveled from California to Canada to testify. She stood in the courtroom and looked at the man she had once married. She told the jury about how he had acted when they lived together. She described his strange jealousies, his violent behavior, and his bizarre religious talk. When she was asked about his mental state, she gave a very direct answer. She said she believed he was absolutely insane. This was a powerful statement, but it came from someone who was not a doctor. To get a professional opinion, the court had already arranged for Nelson to be examined by a psychiatrist. This was Dr. Alvin T. Mathers, who was the chief of the psychiatric ward at the Winnipeg General Hospital. Dr. Mathers had met with Nelson 5 different times in the months before the trial. He had talked with him, observed him, and studied his mind. When Dr. Mathers took the stand, everyone listened closely. His conclusion was very important for the case. He told the court, "I did not find any evidence that to me would constitute insanity." In other words, according to this doctor, Ole Nelson knew what he was doing. He was not insane in the legal sense. He was responsible for his actions. While he was in jail waiting for the trial to end, the guards who watched over him noticed something interesting. Nelson spent a great deal of time reading his Bible. He seemed to be obsessed with one particular passage from the book of Proverbs. It was a verse that talked about whores and strange women being like a deep ditch and a narrow pit. He would read it over and over. This obsession with religion, mixed with his hatred for women, was a window into his dark mind, but it did not change the facts of the case. The lawyers made their final speeches to the jury on November 5th, 1927. They summarized all the evidence. Then, the jury of 12 men left the courtroom to make their decision. They were gone for only 40 minutes. When they came back, the room was silent. The foreman of the jury stood up. He was asked for the verdict. He spoke one word, guilty. The jury had found Earl Nelson guilty of murder. Because this was a murder conviction, the punishment was automatic under the law. There was no choice. The judge looked at Nelson and sentenced him to death. After the sentence was read, the judge asked Nelson if he had anything to say. Nelson looked back with a calm and uncaring expression. He simply said, "No, not that I know of." He showed no emotion, no fear, and no sadness for what he had done. After the trial, Nelson was taken to a special part of the jail called Death Row. This was where condemned prisoners waited for their execution. He was there for 2 months. During this time, some relatives of the women he had killed came to visit him in prison. They wanted to look him in the eye and hear him admit what he had done. But Nelson would not confess. He continued to say he was innocent, even though all the evidence showed he was guilty. He also tried to find a way to escape his punishment. He told the prison officials that if they would let him live, he would spend the rest of his life studying religion. He promised to become a holy man. They did not believe him. Nelson's lawyer, James Stitt, did not give up. In late December, he prepared a long document, 30 pages long, and sent it to the Canadian Minister of Justice, a man named Ernest Lapointe. In this document, Stitt asked for mercy for his client. He argued again that Nelson was insane and should not be executed. He included with this document 20 sworn statements, called affidavits, from people who had known Nelson throughout his life. These people swore that they believed Nelson had been of unsound mind for a very long time. One of these statements came from a woman named Mrs. L. J. Casey. She had hired Nelson as a groundskeeper in 1926. In her statement, she described how she would hear him laughing and talking to himself all day long. She told a story about a day when it was raining very hard. She saw Nelson go outside, sit down in the pouring rain without a coat, and just stare up at the sky until he was completely soaked. Stories like this showed how strange he was, but the Minister of Justice reviewed the appeal and decided it was not enough. The law would take its course. The execution was scheduled for the second Friday of January 1928. That day came on January 13th, 1928. It was a Friday morning in Winnipeg. The weather was cold. Inside the Vaughan Street jail, Ole Nelson was led from his cell to the place where he would be hanged. A small group of official witnesses was there to watch. They included lawmen and doctors. Nelson was asked if he had any final words. He showed no fear. He spoke his last sentence clearly. "I forgive those who have wronged me." He did not ask for forgiveness for himself. He did not mention his victims. He simply said he forgave others. At exactly 7:30 in the morning, the trapdoor opened and Earl Nelson was hanged by the neck until he was dead. A doctor examined him and confirmed that his heart had stopped. The life of the man who had killed so many women was over. After his death, the full scope of his crimes became clear. He had traveled across an entire continent, leaving a trail of bodies behind him. At the time, His confirmed total of 22 murders was the largest number ever attributed to one person in the history of the United States. Newspapers all over the world had written stories about him. People had followed the case on the radio. He became a symbol of pure evil. His terrible methods, especially the way he used religion to trick his victims, shocked the public. Many years later, his story would even inspire a famous movie director named Alfred Hitchcock to make a film called Shadow of a Doubt. But for the families of Clara Newman, Laura Beale, Lillian St. Mary, Ollie Russell, Mary Nisbet, Beata Withers, Virginia Grant, Mabel Fluke, Anna Edmonds, Florence Monks, Blanche Myers, Almira Burrard, Bonnie Pace, Germania Harpin, Baby Robert Harpin, Mary McConnell, Jenny Randolph, Fannie Mae, Maureen Aderthie, Mary Sietsma, Lola Cowan, and Emily Patterson. The hanging of Earl Nelson brought a final end to the search for justice, but it could never bring back the lives that were so cruelly taken from them. Story 4. Gary Mark Gilmore was born on December 4th, 1940, in a small town in Texas called McCamey. His name at birth was not Gary. His father, Frank Gilmore, was using a false last name to stay away from the law, so he named his son Fay Robert Kaufman. Later, after the family left Texas, Gary's mother, Bessie, changed the boy's name to Gary Mark. She did this to give the family a fresh start. This name change would become a source of confusion and anger for Gary many years later when he accidentally found his original birth certificate. Frank Gilmore, Gary's father, was a difficult man. He traveled around a lot and made a living by selling fake magazine subscriptions. This meant the family never stayed in one place for very long. Frank had been married before and had other children that he did not support. He had a bad temper and was quick to become angry. He often hit his sons, including Gary, with a belt or a strap for what seemed like little or no reason. As Gary grew up, he and his father did not get along well. They argued often, and there was a lot of tension in the house. Gary's mother, Bessie, also had a difficult life. She came from a town called Provo in Utah. She and Frank argued loudly and frequently. They would shout cruel names at each other. Bessie would sometimes threaten Frank late at night. This constant fighting created a home life that was full of stress and unhappiness for the children. The family moved from state to state across the western part of the United States, never putting down roots for long. In 1952, when Gary was about 12 years old, the Gilmore family finally settled in a city called Portland, in the state of Oregon. By this time, Gary was a teenager. He was actually very smart. Tests at school showed he had a high intelligence score of 133. He also did well on his school exams and showed some skill in drawing and art. But despite being smart, Gary did not like school. He decided to stop going when he was only in the 9th grade. Not long after he dropped out, he ran away from home with a friend. They traveled all the way back to Texas, but after a few months, Gary returned to his family in Portland. When Gary was 14 years old, he started getting into trouble with the law. He and some of his friends began stealing cars. They formed a small group to do this. This led to his very first arrest by the police. Because he was so young, the police let him go with a warning and sent him back home to his father. But Gary did not stop. Only 2 weeks later, he was caught stealing another car. This time, the court decided he needed to be punished. They sent him to a special school for boys who broke the law, called the McLaren Reform School for Boys, which was in a town called Woodburn in Oregon. He stayed there for about a year before being released. Even after his time at the Reform School, Gary continued to break the law. In 1960, when he was 20 years old, he was arrested once more for stealing a car. This time, he was sent to a more serious prison called the Oregon State Correctional Institution. He was released later that same year, but his pattern of criminal behavior was already set. He would get out of prison, but soon after, he would commit another crime and be sent back. In 1961, Gary's father, Frank, became very sick. The doctors told him he had lung cancer that could not be cured. At that time, Gary was in a local jail in Portland called Rocky Butte Jail. He was facing charges for driving without a license. Near the end of July in 1962, a guard at the jail told Gary that his father had died. Even though Gary and his father had always fought and had a bad relationship, the news hit him very hard. He was completely overcome with sadness and despair. Right there in his jail cell, he tried to kill himself by cutting his wrists. The guards found him and stopped him, but this showed how deeply troubled he was inside. After his father died, Gary's life got worse. He began drinking alcohol heavily, and his behavior became more unpredictable and violent. In 1964, he was arrested for more serious crimes, including assault and armed robbery. Because he had been in trouble with the law so many times before, the judge called him a habitual offender. This meant he was given a very long sentence, 15 years in prison. He was sent to the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem. While he was there, a psychiatrist at the prison evaluated him. The doctor diagnosed him with a condition called antisocial personality disorder. This meant he had a long-term pattern of ignoring the rights of others and breaking rules. The doctor also noted that sometimes Gary lost touch with reality. In 1972, after serving 8 years, Gary was given a conditional release. This meant he could leave prison, but had to follow strict rules. He was sent to live during the week at a halfway house in a city called Eugene, Oregon. A halfway house is a place where people just out of prison can live while they adjust to being free. He was supposed to study art at a local community college, but Gary never even signed up for classes. Within just 1 month, he committed another armed robbery. He was arrested, found guilty, and sent back to prison. Because Gary had caused so much trouble and violence in the Oregon prison, the authorities decided to move him. In 1975, they transferred him to a very high-security federal prison in a place called Marion, in the state of Illinois. This was a prison for the most difficult inmates. Then, in April of 1976, after about a year in Illinois, Gary was granted parole again. Parole means he was released early, but had to follow certain conditions. He was now 35 years old. For his parole, Gary had to have a place to live. He decided to go to Provo, Utah. This was his mother's hometown, and he had a distant cousin there named Brenda Nickel. Brenda agreed to let him stay with her and try to help him get his life together. She helped him find small jobs. For a short time, he worked at his uncle's shoe repair shop. Then he got a job working for a company that installed insulation in houses. But Gary did not keep these jobs for long. He soon went back to his old ways. He started stealing things again, drinking too much, and getting into fights. While living in Provo, Gary met a young woman. Her name was Nicole Barrett Baker. She was only 19 years old. She had already been married twice and had 2 small children. At first, Gary and Nicole's relationship was just casual, but very quickly it became very serious and intense. Gary's behavior, however, was often aggressive and difficult. Nicole's family did not want her to see him. They put a lot of pressure on her to stop the relationship. This created a lot of stress for both Gary and Nicole. Gary was an ex-convict with no steady job and a violent past, trying to build a new life, but the old patterns were already pulling him back. In the summer of 1976, Gary Gilmore was living in Provo, Utah, and his life was falling apart. His relationship with Nicole Barrett Baker was intense, but filled with conflict. Her family did not want them together, and this caused constant arguments. Gary was also having trouble keeping a job. He had worked for a short time at an insulation company, but he soon stopped showing up. He had no money and no clear path forward. He began drinking heavily again, and his thoughts became dark and he felt trapped and angry. On the evening of July 19, 1976, Gary made a decision that would change everything. He drove to a gas station in a nearby town called Orem, Utah. The gas station was a Sinclair station. It was getting late, and the area was quiet. Gary walked into the station. Inside, working alone, was a young man named Max Jensen. Max was 24 years old. He was a student at Brigham Young University. He was also a newlywed, married to his wife Colleen, and they had a baby who was just 4 weeks old. Gary pulled out a gun. It was a .22 caliber pistol. He pointed the gun at Max Jensen and demanded money. Max did not argue or fight. He did exactly what Gary told him to do. He opened the cash register and gave Gary all the money that was inside. After taking the money, Gary did not leave. He ordered Max to lie down on the floor. Max obeyed. He lay down on the cold, dirty floor of the gas station. Then, without any warning or reason, Gary shot him in the head. Max Jensen died instantly. Gary left the gas station and drove away. He had just committed murder for no reason other than his own rage and despair. The very next evening, on July 20th, 1976, Gary struck again. This time he was in Provo, where he lived. He went to a place called the City Center Motel. It was a small motel located at 1675 North 200 West in Provo. Inside the motel office, working that night, was a man named Benny Bushnell. Benny was 56 years old. He was the manager of the motel. Like Max Jensen, Benny Bushnell was also a student at Brigham Young University. He was studying to get his advanced degree. He was also married and had a family. Gary entered the motel office with the same .22 caliber pistol. He pointed the gun at Benny Bushnell and demanded money. Just like the night before, the victim did not resist. Benny gave Gary the money from the motel register. Gary then gave the same order. He told Benny to lie down on the floor. Benny lay down. Gary stood over him and shot him once in the head. Benny Bushnell died right there on the floor of his own motel office. In 2 nights, Gary had killed 2 innocent men who had done nothing to him. Both men had families. Both men had complied with his every demand. Both were dead. After shooting Benny Bushnell, Gary left the motel office. But this time, something happened that would lead to his capture. As he was leaving the scene of the crime, he still had the pistol in his hand. He was trying to get rid of the gun. While handling it, the gun went off accidentally. The bullet hit Gary in his right hand. It was a painful wound that began to bleed heavily. Gary quickly wrapped his hand with a crude bandage, but the blood soaked through. Before the murder of Benny Bushnell, Gary had taken his truck to a service garage to be repaired. The garage was located very close to the motel. After shooting himself, Gary went to the garage to pick up his truck. The mechanic working there that day was a man named Michael Simpson. Michael saw Gary approach. He noticed that Gary's right hand was wrapped up and that blood was soaking through the bandage and dripping onto the ground. Michael thought this was strange. While Gary was at the garage, Michael Simpson heard something on his police scanner. A police scanner is a radio that lets you listen to police communications. Michael heard a report about a shooting that had just happened at the City Center Motel. He knew the motel was right nearby. He immediately connected this news to the man with the bleeding hand standing in front of him. Michael watched Gary carefully. He saw Gary walk over to some bushes near the garage. Gary reached into the bushes and hid something. Michael realized it must be the gun. Gary then came back to pay for his truck repairs. Michael wrote down the license plate number of Gary's truck. As soon as Gary drove away, Michael Simpson called the police. He told them what he had seen. A man with a bleeding hand hiding something in the bushes near the garage where a motel shooting had just occurred. He gave them the license plate number. The police went to the garage and searched the bushes. They found the .22 caliber pistol hidden there. After he left the garage, Gary drove back to Provo. His hand was in severe pain, and the bleeding would not stop. He did not know what to do. He called his cousin, Brenda Nickel, the woman he was living with. He told her he had hurt his hand, and asked her to bring him some bandages and painkillers. Brenda could tell something was very wrong. Gary sounded desperate and strange on the phone. She became frightened. After thinking about it, Brenda decided she had to call the police. She told them Gary was injured and gave them his location. The Utah State Police immediately began looking for Gary's truck. They spotted him trying to drive out of Provo. They pulled him over and surrounded his vehicle. Gary did not try to run or fight. He gave up without any struggle. The police arrested him. They saw his injured hand and took him to get medical treatment. They also informed him that he was being charged with murder. Inside the truck, they found evidence linking him to the crimes. Gary was taken to the Utah County Jail. When the police investigated the two murder scenes, they found a trail of blood leading from the motel to the bushes where the gun was hidden. They matched this blood to Gary's wounded hand. They also found bullet casings at both crime scenes. A ballistics expert from the FBI would later prove that the casings from both murders came from the same gun, the .22 caliber pistol found in the bushes. The police also found a witness. A guest who was staying at the City Center Motel the night of the second murder came forward. His name was Peter Arroyo. He told police he had seen Gary in the motel office right around the time of the shooting. Gary was now in jail, charged with 2 brutal murders. The evidence against him was very strong. There was a witness who placed him at the scene of the second murder. There was the gun, hidden near the scene, linked to him by a witness and by his own blood trail. There were the bullet casings matching the gun to both victims. There was his own injury, suffered right after the second killing. There was no way to deny what he had done. The two families, the Jensens and the Bushnells, were left to grieve for their husbands and fathers. The community was shocked that such violent crimes had happened so close to home. Gary Gilmore sat in his cell, waiting for what would come next. Gary Gilmore sat in the Utah County Jail after his arrest in July 1976. The police had gathered all the evidence they needed. They had the gun. They had the bullet casings. They had a witness who saw him at the motel. They had the trail of his own blood leading from the crime scene to where he hid the weapon. The case against him was solid and complete. There was no mystery left to solve. The only question now was what would happen to him in a court of law. Gary was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. 1 count was for the killing of Max Jensen at the gas station in Orem. The other count was for the killing of Benny Bushnell at the motel in Provo. Because the evidence for the Bushnell murder was so strong, including the witness and the gun, the prosecutors decided to focus on that case first. They knew that if they could get a conviction for that murder, the other case would not need to go to trial. The trial began on October 5th, 1976, at the courthouse in Provo. It was a short trial, lasting only 2 days. Gary was assigned 2 lawyers to defend him. Their names were Michael Esplin and Craig Snyder. They were court-appointed, which meant the state paid for them because Gary had no money of his own. The prosecutors presented their case to the jury. They called their witnesses one by one to explain what happened on the night of July 20th. First, the witness Peter Arroyo took the stand. He was the guest at the City Center Motel. He told the jury that on the night of the murder, he saw a man in the motel office. He described the man, and that description matched Gary Gilmore. He said he saw the man inside the office, and then shortly after, he heard that the motel manager had been shot. Next, a patrolman who had responded to the crime scene testified. He explained to the jury how he had followed the trail of blood. He showed them on a map how the drops of blood led from the motel office, across the parking lot, and directly to the bushes near the service garage. He told them that was where the gun was later found. Then the FBI ballistics expert, a man named Gerald F. Wilkes, took the stand. He explained the science of matching bullets to guns. He showed the jury the 2 shell casings found at the motel. He showed them the bullet that had been removed from Benny Bushnell's body during the autopsy. He then showed them the .22 caliber pistol that was found in the bushes. He explained that he had test-fired the gun in a laboratory. He used a microscope to compare the marks on the test bullets with the marks on the casings and the fatal bullet. He told the jury that they were a perfect match. The gun from the bushes was without any doubt the gun that killed Benny Bushnell. Gary's two lawyers did very little to fight this evidence. They did not cross-examine most of the witnesses. Cross-examination is when a lawyer asks questions to try to find problems with a witness's testimony. Gary's lawyers mostly sat silent. They did not call any witnesses of their own to speak for Gary. They rested their case without presenting any defense. This upset Gary. He did not understand why his own lawyers were not fighting for him. The next day, he asked the judge if he could speak. He wanted to take the witness stand himself. He thought maybe he could argue that he was not in his right mind when he committed the murders. He wanted to plead insanity. The judge listened to Gary's request. But before he could decide, Gary's lawyers spoke up. They told the judge that they had consulted with 4 different psychiatrists. All 4 doctors had examined Gary. They all agreed on the same thing. They said that Gary knew what he was doing on the night of the murder. They said he knew that shooting someone was wrong. They said he had a personality disorder, which made him antisocial and violent. But that did not mean he was insane under the law. Because his own doctors said he was legally sane, Gary could not use an insanity defense. After hearing this, Gary withdrew his request to testify. He sat back down. When it was time for the closing statements, one of Gary's lawyers, Michael Esplin, tried a different approach. He spoke to the jury. He pointed out that Gary had accidentally shot himself right after the murder. He suggested to the jury that maybe the killing was also an accident. He said there were no witnesses who actually saw Gary pull the trigger. He asked the jury to consider finding Gary guilty of a lesser crime, like second-degree murder. He even suggested they could acquit him, which means find him not guilty. But his arguments were weak, and the evidence against Gary was overwhelming. On October 7, 1976, the jury left the courtroom to discuss their verdict. They did not take long. By the middle of the day, they returned. The courtroom was quiet as the foreman of the jury stood up and read the decision. The jury found Gary Gilmore guilty of first-degree murder. First-degree murder means the killing was deliberate and planned. It is the most serious type of murder charge. Under Utah law at that time, a conviction for first-degree murder had 2 possible punishments: life in prison or the death penalty. The jury had to decide which one to give. They listened to more arguments from both sides. Then they left again to deliberate on the punishment. Later that same day, they returned with their recommendation. Because of the special circumstances of the crime, robbing and then shooting an unarmed man who was lying on the floor, the jury unanimously recommended the death sentence. The judge accepted their recommendation and formally sentenced Gary Gilmore to die. Now that he was sentenced to death, Gary had a choice to make. In Utah, there were 2 legal methods of execution. One was hanging. The other was death by firing squad. Gary thought about it. He believed that a hanging could go wrong and cause him to suffer. He decided he wanted the firing squad. He told the court, "I'd prefer to be shot." The date for his execution was set for November 15, 1976, at 8 o'clock in the morning. Gary accepted his sentence. He did not want to fight it. He told people that he deserved to die for what he had done. He wanted the execution to happen as quickly as possible. But other people did not agree with him. A group called the American Civil Liberties Union, often shortened to the ACLU, believed the death penalty was wrong. They started working on Gary's case. They filed legal papers to try to stop the execution. They argued that his rights had been violated and that he should get more appeals. An appeal is when a higher court reviews a case to see if there were any legal mistakes. Gary's mother, Bessie, also did not want her son to be executed. Even though they had a difficult relationship, she loved him. She hired her own lawyers and sued the state to try to get a stay of execution. A stay is a court order that delays a punishment. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. Bessie's lawyers argued that Gary should not be allowed to give up his right to appeal. But the Supreme Court disagreed. In a 5-4 vote, they refused to stop the execution. They said that Gary, as an adult, had the right to waive his appeals if he chose to. Despite the Supreme Court's decision, the ACLU kept trying. They filed more legal motions. Because of their efforts, Gary received several stays of execution. Each time a new execution date was set, the ACLU would get a court to delay it. This went on for months. Gary became very angry about this. He did not want to be saved. He wanted the process to be over. In November 1976, he spoke at a hearing. He said he wanted the ACLU and the religious leaders who were trying to stop his execution to leave him alone. He said, "This is my life and this is my death. It's been sanctioned by the courts that I die and I accept that." While he waited on death row, Gary tried to kill himself twice. The first time was on November 16th, right after the first stay was issued. The second time was a month later, on December 16th. Both times, prison staff found him and stopped him. He was watched closely after that. He also continued to communicate with Nicole Barrett Baker, the young woman he had been seeing before his arrest. Their relationship remained intense even though he was in prison. The final execution date was set for January 17th, 1977, at sunrise. As that day approached, the legal battles continued. The ACLU filed one last motion. Just hours before the scheduled execution, a judge granted another stay. This meant the execution could not happen. But the state of Utah fought back. Their lawyers immediately appealed that decision. At 7:30 in the morning on January 17th, just 30 minutes before the scheduled time, the last stay was overturned by a higher court. The execution was allowed to proceed. Gary was moved to an old building behind the prison. It had once been a cannery where food was processed, but now it was used as the death house. Inside, there was a wooden chair. Behind the chair, prison workers had stacked sandbags against the wall. The sandbags would trap the bullets, so they did not ricochet. A black hood was prepared to cover his face. A curtain was set up with 5 small holes cut into it. Behind this curtain, 5 volunteer police officers stood waiting. They were all from the local county. Each man held a .30-30 caliber rifle loaded with a powerful bullet. 4 of the rifles had real bullets. One had a blank, so no officer would know for sure if he fired the fatal shot. Just after 8 o'clock in the morning, Gary was brought into the room. He was wearing white pants, a white t-shirt, and white socks. The prison staff strapped him into the wooden chair. A Catholic priest named Thomas Mearsman was with him. The priest had given Gary his last rites, a special prayer for the dying. The prison doctor placed the black hood over Gary's head. Through the hood, someone asked Gary if he had any last words. His final words were simple. He said, "Let's do it." Then, speaking to the priest in Latin, he said, "Dominus vobiscum," which means, "The Lord be with you." The priest replied in Latin, "Et cum spiritu tuo," meaning, "and with your spirit." The 5 officers behind the curtain aimed their rifles at a small white target that had been pinned to Gary's t-shirt over his heart. They fired. The shots rang out at the same time. Gary was hit and died immediately. The time was 8:07 in the morning. He was the first person to be executed in the United States in nearly 10 years. Before his execution, the death penalty had been stopped by the Supreme Court, but new laws had just made it legal again. After he was pronounced dead, Gary's body was prepared for what came next. Before his execution, he had made a request. He wanted to donate his organs to help other people. Within just a few hours, 2 people received his corneas in transplant surgeries, giving them back their sight. Gary's body was then taken for an autopsy, which is a medical examination to confirm the cause of death. Later that same day, his body was cremated, which means it was burned to ashes in a special furnace. The next day, a small memorial service was held for him at a funeral home in Provo called Walker Mortuary. After the service, his ashes were placed in an airplane. The plane flew over an area called Spanish Fork, Utah. From the air, his ashes were scattered and fell down over the land. His remains had been returned to the earth. The two families he had destroyed were left to cope with their loss. Colleen Jensen was now a widow raising her baby alone. The Bushnell family had lost a husband and father. Gary Gilmore's crimes had taken two innocent men from their loved ones. His execution brought an end to his life, but it could not bring back the lives he had taken. His case became famous because he was the first person executed after the death penalty was restored, and his story was told in books, movies, and songs for many years to come. But for those who knew Max Jensen and Benny Bushnell, the story was not about fame or history. It was about the men they loved who were gone forever.